Good morning. Well, hopefully your Wednesday is off to a good start. Mine is so far. A little chilly in my outdoor office, but it's a good day. And of course, the coffee with the preacher mug made by my favorite potter. So as we are really getting near the end of our series, just looking we began with Genesis, looking at the various books of the Bible. When were they written? Who wrote them? Sort of what we find in each of them. We are getting now near the end of Paul's letters, and we've done Romans and 2 letters to Corinthians. And remember that there are actually more than 2 letters to Corinth that he wrote. And then last week, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. Today, we will look at his last 2 letters to churches. Then next week, we'll do the pastoral epistles, which are letters to individuals, Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And then after that, Hebrews and James. Then Peter and Jude. And then we wrap up with a week of Revelation. So for today, Thessalonians. 2 letters. Paul wrote 2 letters to the little church at Thessalonica. This was a church that he had founded, and when we read 1 Thessalonians, this is perhaps the earliest book written in the New Testament. There is a little bit of debate in scholarly circles about which was written first, Galatians or First Thessalonians. They're the 2 earliest, and this flip a coin as to which was written first. And these Pauline letters were actually the first books written in the New Testament. Most of Paul's letters came before the Gospels were written. So, a little bit about Thessalonica. This was a church that Paul had founded, and Paul is writing to them from Corinth, and Timothy apparently has been to the church there and has come back, and now Paul is writing them. And speaking now specifically of 1 Thessalonians, Paul is writing them, and this relatively short letter, it's shorter than the others. And remember, Paul's letters their order is longest to shortest. He writes him to address some things that are going on. In terms of the structure of the letter, if you're careful and you read through it, you can pick up the structure. It begins with a prayer. More than 2 chapters worth of just thanksgiving. Paul is thankful for their faithfulness. Paul is thankful for their faithfulness, the way they have been genuine and faithful to the gospel. Then in the middle of chapter 3, verses 13 to 11 to 13, 11 to 14, something like that in chapter 3, you have another prayer. It's almost a benediction. And then Paul goes into and challenging them to be holy, to live holy lives, particularly in terms of morality, just personal morality, sexual morality, whatnot. And then with another closing benediction or prayer at the end. In reading through 1 Thessalonians, and really with both of these letters, one of the main concerns is the second coming. One of the main concerns is the second coming. The technical term is parousia. That is the Greek word that gets translated as coming. In 1 Thessalonians, this was written, say, maybe 48, 49 AD, in that time frame. And there was very much an expectation that Jesus was going to be coming back at any moment. There's, if you read depending upon how you read the Gospels, you can get the impression that some people who were alive when Jesus was in his earthly ministry would live long enough to see him return again. And so there's this talk going around, and they're thinking he could be coming now. And in particular, in 1 Thessalonians, there was a real fear that what about our beloved brethren who have already died? What about our beloved brethren who have already died? Have they missed out? The only people who will, is it true that the only people who will enjoy the blessings of Christ's return are those who are alive when he comes? And so Paul, in probably the most famous portion of 1 Thessalonians, this is in chapter 4, addresses this head on. Okay, what about those who have died in Christ, the dead in Christ? Have they missed the party, so to speak? And he says that when Christ returns, he'll come with a trumpet sound, and the dead in Christ will rise first, and then those who are alive will meet him in the air. Something to point out, that term that gets translated as coming in verse 15 is parousia, and that is sort of a loaded term. That is a term that was used to refer to, say, the return of a long-lost king or ruler. So you've got a long-lost king or ruler that is returning to a city. A delegation leaves the city to go meet him, and they come back into the city with him. And that's what you've got going on. That is the image. In using that term parousia, it's not implying that people will leave here and go somewhere else. The implication is that they will meet Jesus there and come back here. Now, of course, what that looks like in real terms, we don't know. But that is, people get really worked up over trying to put together what this means. Is this the rapture? And really, this is all about resurrection. These verses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 are all about the resurrection. The point is, the emphasis is, what about the dead in Christ? Those who are alive in Christ's return are almost an afterthought. The whole point is, what about the dead in Christ? When Christ returns, they will rise. So that takes us to 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians was written, obviously, sometime a little later, probably not a great time span, maybe a couple of years, but certainly not like 10 years or 15 years. So 1 Thessalonians 48 or 49 AD, in that time frame. 2 Thessalonians would be a year or two later. And again, Paul is writing to them because he's heard back from about how they're doing. It appears that the church is being persecuted. At this point, we shouldn't envision this being like heavy-handed, top-down, imperial Roman persecution, people being fed to lions kind of thing. That will come, but that's probably not what we're looking at here. There are other forms of persecution besides Roman centurions busting in your door and then hauling you off to feed you to lions. Other forms of persecution that can be just as real. There was a feeling that these Thessalonian Christians, they say they've got a new king. Does that mean they're not loyal to Caesar? And if you're not loyal to Caesar, you can be shunned socially. You can be shunned economically, where people won't do business with you. There are an awful lot of other forms of persecution besides being rounded up and sent into the arena. And this letter too deals a lot with the Perusia. And Paul emphasizes that the coming of the Lord is sort of equal parts, judgment and salvation. It is judgment for the unbelievers and the wicked. It is salvation for the faithful. And in doing that, Paul is right in line with the ancient concept of the day of the Lord. The prophets had this notion of the day of the Lord, where God himself returns to set things right. Set things right in the world. And setting things right is part judgment on the wicked, on the oppressors, and also vindication and salvation for the faithful. And apparently with 2 Thessalonians, there were some people, after receiving the first letters, some people had begun to teach that maybe Christ had already returned. Maybe he's already turned, and they have all just missed it somehow. And so Paul writes to them. And in writing 2 Thessalonians, we could look at it this way, that 1 Thessalonians, Christ can come at any moment. Our dad and Christ haven't missed the party. In 2 Thessalonians, it's be patient. Be patient. It hasn't happened yet. There are things that are going to take place before Christ returns. Be patient. And perhaps these two letters use the phrase, are like the yin and yang of eschatology. Be ready, but don't spend your every day looking up, expecting to come back. Be ready, but don't get lost in idle speculation about when and how. And then Paul is emphatic about this. If the idea of Jesus returning is something that provokes fear, then you sort of miss the point. In particular, this is something that is a little enigmatic. Paul refers in 2 Thessalonians to a man of lawlessness without saying any more about who that person is. Apparently it is some sort of evil or demonically inspired figure who will show up in the world before Christ returns. That is the safest assumption, but Paul doesn't give us anything about that. Doesn't say anything more about this man of lawlessness. So again, all we can assume is that it is some sort of evil, demonically inspired ruler. Sometimes people will make a connection between this man of lawlessness and the 2 Thessalonians and the beast, one of the beasts in Revelation. Perhaps that's legitimate. And then Paul ends up with this. He admonishes them, he encourages them to get busy. Nothing has happened yet. It may not even be imminent. So go on about your lives. He warns them against being idle, against being irresponsible. There are two different ways we could look at this. One is this, that people are so busy looking up. Okay, Jesus could be coming back today, so there's no point in me showing up to work. And in the meantime, sort of mooching off the generosity of others. The other way that we could take it, and this is equally valid, and you can choose for yourselves which makes the most sense to you. is that there, as in elsewhere in Roman culture, you've got the very wealthy, and they have servants who tend to them and give them stuff and do stuff for them. And that this is an encouragement and admonition by Paul, and just get to work. Don't survive off of, speaking to the very wealthy, don't survive off all these poor people doing your work for you. And again, you can decide for yourselves about which is most likely to be accurate. But this is 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Relatively early among Paul's letters. 1st Thessalonians may be the earliest. The other competitor there is Galatians. And they both deal with this idea of the coming, Jesus' second coming of Parousia. In 1 Thessalonians, your dead have not missed the party. They're going to be, in fact, they're going to be first when Christ returns. And in 2 Thessalonians, just get busy. Don't spend your lives just looking up, idly looking up, but just get busy. Don't spend your lives in idle speculation about when he's coming. Just be ready. And that's not a bad admonition for all of us. So with that, hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. And next week we will look at the pastoral epistles, Timothy, Titus, and Philemon.